Hello, everybody. Just going to say you are all stuck with me for the next 45 minutes, but three lovely distinguished leaders are going to be joining me. Please join me in welcoming Nicole Bonney, CEO of the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. Hello. Please welcome Nuzhat Jafri, Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. And finally, you know her well, Dr. Samantha Nutt, founder and president of War Child USA and Canada, and assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us at the Women's Leadership Forum, and thank you all for joining and participating today. We're going to be talking for 45 minutes, lots of questions about sort of challenges, obstacles, and some advice as well. I'm going to start off, a question to all of you. I'm going to start off with Nicole. What inspired you to take on a leadership role?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and want to acknowledge the Indigenous territories that we are on, and certainly myself as a settler to this land. In terms of what inspired me to take on this leadership role, it really would be the absence of representation. The absence of women, Black women, racialized women, who were CEOs or who are CEOs in the public sector, and also in the private sector. And the opportunity to really model the possibilities of what it looks like for certainly younger women, seeing that representation that I didn't often see.
All right, Nuzhat, I'm going to come to you. Same question. What inspired you to take on a leadership role?
Thank you. Thanks to AMO for inviting me and including me on this panel. And thank you for the land that we're on today, and a privilege as a settler to be on this Algonquin land. So thank you. What inspired me, really, I think I sort of stumbled upon being in a leadership role because I really wanted to do things that could help people in their lives, make a difference in their lives. And because I worked in different sectors, I wanted to be in a place where I could do something to actually make change. So I kept on working at it, and I changed sectors several times. And now I'm in a place where I can at least influence policy, I can influence behaviors maybe. And so I would say I stumbled upon it, but I did it because I wanted to make a difference in other people's lives.
Sam, same question to you.
That is a very interesting question. I would say for me it was the work itself, because I had spent, after graduating from medical school, I first had the opportunity to work in Somalia with UNICEF, largely as a volunteer at that moment in time, and then had gone on to work with different organizations and really felt that the sort of big gaps were not being addressed around inequality, around women's rights, around education, and felt that there was a need for a different kind of humanitarian model that actually looked at some of the drivers of poverty and conflict within those countries and invested in local communities and local community actors as the priority. And I didn't see that in the networks that existed at the time. It was a largely dependent on an expatriate infrastructure that packed up and fled to the next conflict whenever the opportunity required it. So for me, I really, it was bearing witness to war and to the atrocities of war, and then recognizing that there was a gap that needed to be filled, and then slowly and incrementally kind of rising to that occasion by trying to create something. But I'm not someone who would necessarily put myself out there instinctively or naturally, and we had discussed this somewhat backstage. The three of us were all talking about how nervous we even just get coming out here. And that was very much me, and in fact, until about the age of 26 or 27, I would be deathly afraid of leaving a voicemail message because I would worry that my voice would be too high, or I would say something stupid and I would sound dumb. And it's hard to believe that, first of all, I ever thought that, because I've come to understand, especially after Trump's election, that men say and do stupid things all the time.
It's true.
Without apology, regret, or remorse, right? So you got to own that. But it has certainly, I think, out of necessity, I've been forced into a leadership role, but it's still something that I wrestle with very much.
All right, I want to ask you three, you have been in leadership positions throughout your careers, and I wanted to ask, we'll be talking about challenges and obstacles, of course, but what are the advantages of being a female leader? I'll go to Nicole first.
The advantages, it's interesting asking that question in a structure of patriarchy, right, and in the existence where you see the barriers of sexism that are so overt and evident in everything that we do, including the policies and procedures and structures and what we've inherited, particularly within the child welfare sector and in the public sector at large. But it still rings true when, certainly for my role and for those who are in public sector, that the vast majority of the people that we support and serve are women. And I think that that's often forgotten in light of what the backdrop has looked like for many years in terms of, as I said before, with a lot of the ideologies that permeate our structures that are very male-dominated, but not only that, but it's middle-class driven, it's heteronormative, it's white, and so we often don't remember and center the fact that we serve women, diverse women. We serve women who are racialized and indigenous, and often overrepresented in our systems. And so the advantage that I bring is really being able to bring that intersectional lens to decision making, where I'm not just thinking about one vantage point, but that I'm able to think of multiple worldviews, multiple intersections in decisions and in conversations that really captures a vast, broad section of our community that is often overlooked, but then at the very same time overrepresented. So they're invisible and hypervisible at the same time, and so being able to really bring that perspective.
Thank you. Nuzhat?
I think the biggest advantage is that as a woman, you experience so many challenges already because of the patriarchy that we live in. And you end up having to deal with things that men will never have to deal with. They don't have to bear children. Usually it's the woman who gets up in the middle of the night to feed the child. She's the one who makes their lunch boxes. I'm sorry, I know there are men who do that, so I don't want to offend anyone. But the truth is that women still do the bulk of childcare, housework, and they also have to work outside the home if they choose to do that. And their responsibilities are exacerbated because of a challenge of being a woman in the workplace, even today, where the decision-making often is done by men. And we live in a society where, the deferral, unfortunately, the deferral still today to male decision makers is that we have to keep on working at it. We have to keep on being heard. We have to say, hey, I think I just said that 5 minutes ago. Did you hear me? Happens all the time, A bright idea comes up, and the guy who says it, oh yeah, oh, that's a great idea. Well, I just said it 5 minutes ago. Were you listening? No, we're often not listened to. But the advantage for me is that I can say that to you. I can say, look, I just said that 5 minutes ago, but you paid no attention because it's me, a brown woman people usually don't know whether I'm Muslim or not, but certainly I'm a woman of color. I'm soft-spoken, sorry, I guess I'm getting louder right now, but that's because I want you to hear me. So, you know, I think I have an advantage. I can say that because they're listening, they're finally listening. So, and the other thing is that because of the fact that we are, you know, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I come from an immigrant background, racialized background, and the lessons that you're taught along the way on survival, you know, in this pretty mean world, give you an advantage. You can fight anything, you can do anything. And that's really how I feel about why I'm sitting here in front of you today talking to 2,000 people. That's my advantage. Thank you.
Sam.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Nicole and Nuzhat have said around crushing the patriarchy, so I will certainly endorse those statements. But also I want to pick up on what Nicole said initially, which is that in my work, 80% of refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people in the world, are women and children. And the vast majority of our programming is with women and children, and they are uniquely vulnerable. And so being a woman in the midst of that environment creates its own challenges, certainly. I mean, I have been threatened on many occasions, including with sexual violence in those environments. But at the same time, it gives me unique access to local women's leaders, local community organizations, and it makes it easier, I think, to sort of identify the path forward and to invest in their goals and their vision and their ambitions, because there is a sisterhood, there is a trust, there is a fellowship that comes from that, and I think that that's been an absolute asset. I would also say, picking up on what you said, that as women navigating in this world, you do become more attuned to consensus building and active listening, sometimes as a matter of self-preservation, but also because that is how you have to work to sometimes get ahead and to find the path. And I think that in a leadership role, that can become a very important asset, and it's something that I think that I try to bring to our work and to our organization.
You've all sort of touched on a number of sort of barriers, and I want to pick up on, Sam, you had mentioned earlier in your keynote speech the hostility directed at people in leadership roles. And I'm curious, how do you deal with that in each of your positions, because you wear many hats?
Oh, you want to start with me?
Yeah.
It ranges from muting the person, which is a wonderful feature, to some well-placed words sometimes. I mean, look, you know, I tend to be quite scrappy by nature. I grew up with the last name Nutt. Fortunately, my sister is Pippa, so she's a peanut, so my parents definitely love me the most. And, you know, so I'm quite used to being poked and mocked and put down and diminished and ignored. You know, so for me, it's more, when I see stuff like that, I think that it speaks volumes about that particular person and less about me, and I try to keep that in mind. Sometimes it's difficult, though. It can be difficult. I think that we're living in this age of depersonalization and rage that I think is very toxic and very dangerous, and I try to respond in a way that is reasonable in those environments, but it can be tricky.
All right. Nicole and Nuzhat, I want to ask you a question. Start with, what are some of the invisible barriers racialized women face in particular?
I mean, there's a number of barriers, but you know, I think that when it comes to leadership, I don't think that anyone is successfully able to occupy a position of leadership without sponsorship, without people being able to walk alongside, to mentor, and to support. And this whole theme of invisibility, the theme of silencing, it's hard to then be sponsored and mentored when inevitably you're invisible within the context of the workplace. In addition, I think that there also is kind of the experiences of microaggressions, which in and of itself can be challenged because it really is just forms of violence that happen that are often so covert and unseen in many ways, but felt deeply in all of the different ways in which decisions are made or undermining happens of oneself and one's position in spaces. And so I think that those remain barriers, and certainly for myself and for racialized and many Indigenous women, First Nation, Inuit, Métis women, that I speak to, it still exists, and it becomes even more sophisticated as time goes on, and harder to call out in workspaces. And so it does take so much navigation. It takes a lot of resilience. It takes certainly a lot of fortitude to be able to rise to the occasion in spite of those barriers that many around you don't bear witness to.
Nuzhat, did you want to add on that?
I think it's difficult for someone like Nicole and myself. We are visible because of who we are. People can tell that we're different, perhaps. But then you hear things like, gee, I didn't know you were Muslim. Really? You don't sound Muslim. You don't look Muslim. So I'm there, I'm in front of them, but I'm invisible to them as a whole person. So in fact, for a long, long time, people didn't used to really pay much attention to me because I would try to blend in. I would try to just live my life in the workplace, everywhere, to be accepted. I was raised that way. I was told to be invisible. Don't draw attention to yourself. You're going to get into trouble. Don't be loud. Don't, speak quietly. Be polite. So it was sort of a conditioning to be invisible, not to be noticed. And so I find that those barriers continue to exist in workplaces. And also, Nicole talked about intersectionality and about the fact that each individual person has multiple intersectional identities. You're a woman, you may have a disability or a diverse ability, you may be racialized, you could be a professional person, you could be a tradesperson. There are so many things that shape who you are. And most of those intersections are actually invisible. But when you start thinking about the complexity of the human being, each person, then you have to start thinking about how you make them visible. How do you recognize that they exist in your workplace, that they're contributing to your society, they're contributing to your societies and your towns, and listening to them, talking to them, and understanding who they are so that they become visible to you, from being invisible and always in the background and not being taken seriously.
All right, I want to get some examples from you guys. I'm going to start with Sam. Some examples of how you've ensured women and people of color are represented at all levels at your company, including the interview process and et cetera.
I think in any workplace, the most important thing is, and you picked up on this as well, it's active listening. You have to listen, understand different points of view, and ensure that you're integrating those different points of view. But there also have to be pathways within the organization. So, for example, around the world, as I mentioned, 99% of our staff are local, and that includes at the most senior level, which is our country director level, and then beyond that as well. But that's taken us many years to achieve. So it starts from a place of going into a community, working with our local leaders, working with our staff, working with local organizations, and understanding that that is an iterative process. There has to be a continual investment in that leadership development, because it's not enough to say that you have diversity. You have to have multiple levels of diversity with those kinds of pathways for people to achieve. And it takes time, it takes consistent investment, but more than anything else, it means making that a priority within your organization. And that's something for us. I mean, when you're working, it's a little different for us in the sense that when you're working in war-torn environments, the people who know the most about those environments are the ones who come from those communities and who understand what's going to be required to be able to address people's needs on an ongoing basis. But again, that is very atypical. If you look at the humanitarian networks that exist throughout the world, usually at the most senior level, including at the country director level in country, they are usually expatriate staff. And that struck me as a problem, and now I'm dating myself, but that struck me as a problem in 1997, when I was working for the UN and people were living in different parts of the world, and I felt very dangerously disconnected from the communities they were intending to serve. And that was one of the reasons why we started Wartile Canada a couple of years later. But it takes time, and here we are 20 years later now, and we have that great representation, but it took a lot of consistency and a lot of investment.
Nicole?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. And can you share some examples of ways you've ensured women and people of color are represented at all levels of your company?
Mm-hmm. I really like when I was hearing you speak, I thought of the word intentionality, because it takes such deliberate, intentional, strategic, targeted action to ensure that not only there's representation of women in the workplace, but that demographically within the workplace that we represent the community that we serve, and the communities plural that we serve. And really it in order to do that, it also takes a level of investment and tangible, not only investment in resources, but investment of time and meaningful engagement, authentic engagement, in order to let people know and to really put out those indicators that that it is an inclusive space, and that differing opinions, identities are welcomed in the space. And that doesn't just happen by putting out kind of great posters and strategic plans. It really happens with modeling the way forward, and it happens when community members and staff and employees observe senior management and organizational culture over time. And so these are the types of things where it's certainly the multi-pronged indicators and a multi-pronged approach to really signaling a new direction. And some clear investments and some intentional, thoughtful strategies and actions in order to represent the communities that we're in.
All right, I want to ask, you mentioned posters, and you mentioned, sometimes there are some buzzwords, sometimes there's words that might feel hollow. Sometimes you hear the word inclusion, you hear the word diversity, but what does that really mean? And I want to get an answer from all of you about what inclusion means for you, and I want to start with Nuzhat.
So inclusion for me means allowing individuals, in your organization, to put out their fullest potential, give them an opportunity to show their talents, to provide opportunities for them to excel, opportunities for them to develop, and feel like that they really belong and that they're contributing to that organization in real ways. I really don't like, I've seen, people say, oh, we're very diverse, if you live in Toronto, we have a very, very diverse city. And it doesn't matter which sector you go in, you'll see the diversity is visible. I know that it's not true of course, in many municipalities, but in Toronto, it's extremely visible. But then what does that mean, that diversity that's there? What are they contributing, or how are they contributing to the organization? And what opportunities are we providing to them to show their talents, to develop their talents, so that they feel, okay, they care about me, taking care of everyone in your organization, so that they feel like I'm appreciated, I'm appreciated for what I'm contributing to this organization and to the well-being of the communities that we are serving. It's a real, I would say it's a real boost for people to understand that the work that they do is appreciated, that they are appreciated, and being inclusive means, again, I'm going to go back to it, Sam has already said, I think you said, intentionality, being deliberate about bringing talent in, honoring them, and really be careful about tokenism. You know, you shouldn't be recruiting people so that you can say, yeah, I have one of those on my team. Yeah, I have a person like this, you know. No, it's not good enough just to show that you have one of those in your team. You provide opportunities for them to excel, to grow, and think about the benefit to your organization if you allow for that to happen. That is inclusion. That is bringing them into your organization, feeling them welcome, feeling them like they belong and they're welcomed, but open things up for them. You know, do not be a roadblock. Always think about them, not as they're an asset. They're an asset that you have spent time and energy in bringing into your organization. Let's not waste that time and energy. Let's cultivate their talent so that we can retain and we can help them grow, and also grow our organization in helping the people we want to help.
I'm going to actually ask Nicole that same question as to what inclusion means for you, but I'm curious, how do you create meaningful inclusion efforts without making people in your organization feel singled out? Because that is also sort of a balance that has to be made as well.
You know, it's important in terms of those intentional efforts. And I think one of the key things to understanding, you know, inclusion efforts is also understanding that the existence of exclusion has been around way longer than the concepts of inclusion, in that when we think of, you know, years of oppressive structures that have existed, that have excluded many from decision-making tables, and all you need to do is look down any, I remember being in a school, one of the boardrooms, and looking around at all of the chairs of that particular school board, and they were all white men for about, for so many years that dated back to like the 50s when they started taking these pictures. And then one woman showed up in like the 80s, one woman's photo, and then it continued on. So when we think of how deep we have been in terms of excluding not only women from decision-making tables, but excluding First Nation Inuit Métis people, excluding Black Canadians, excluding racialized identities, excluding non-Christians from the table for many, many years. Our systems are embedded in this idea and in this thinking that really does, I go back to the word of intentionality, to undo that and to unlearn what we have learned for so many years. And so inclusion starts from the place of acknowledging our history and acknowledging the legacy that we have inherited in our current day. And that it is so important, as you talk about, you reference tokenism, and not allowing for that one, you know, I think the key is not allowing for just the one hire, right? And what are we doing beyond just the one identity that represents their community to be put on the spot within our organizations, that it's not good enough to kind of check that one box, but really, how are we doing this again, in a meaningful way that involves multiple representations within the walls of our organizations, so that that one voice doesn't stand alone and speak alone, or that one woman isn't at the boardroom table speaking for all women in your jurisdiction, but that we have to seek and go beyond the one. and really builds community in that authentic, meaningful way. And so those are, that's kind of what I'm thinking, to go beyond just tokenism within organizations.
That's a good one. Sam, I'm going to ask you a similar question here, hoping to get some examples of ways leaders may be unknowingly creating barriers or excluding female employees. There was some good lists there, but I'm wondering if there's any more to add there.
Yes, and I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said, so I won't repeat that. I think it's I certainly can't. You said it so beautifully. I would say, look, when you're running an organization, it's also being aware of the barriers that you exist and who you reward and why you're rewarding them. And I'll give you some very practical examples. I mean, if you ever want to see me lose my mind, schedule a breakfast meeting in our office. And that's because, you know, we have a lot of single parents in our office, a lot of them are female, and just the act of waking up early, getting your child to school requires an insane amount of logistics, and when you schedule those 7:30 in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning meetings, some of those people end up having to opt out or feeling as if their contribution isn't being valued. In the same way, when I hear managers and others who will say to me, well, this person works incredibly hard and they put in really long hours, and I go, well, yeah, but what are they actually accomplishing? You know, who we're looking to invest in needs to change and needs to be different, and we need to understand or do a better job of understanding the whole person, what they're bringing to an organization, the perspective that they bring, the diversity, the richness of experience that they have to offer, and not the sort of standard metrics that were set in 1958 around, you know, it's the white guy who shows up first thing in the morning and, you know, goes to the breakfast meeting and then goes to the golf course and then goes for drinks after work and then is there back at the office until 10 o'clock at night. I mean, that stuff makes me, no pun intended, totally nuts. Like, it really does. I got lots of these jokes, folks.
Great answer. Nuzhat, I want to come to you. For companies looking to diversify their outreach efforts and form a talent pool in non-traditional ways, I've heard that a lot. We haven't had candidates apply, they don't know, we don't know where to go. Any advice? Where can they start?
Well, in our work, allyship is really, really important. So what you have to start doing is reaching people, creating allies in communities that you traditionally may not have reached out to. So we're happy with municipalities in particular that have been working with us. They invite us to the tables, they attend our events, they've become very engaged with us lately in some communities, and we really welcome that. So if you want to diversify your workforce, all levels, it's really great to go to places, to go to organizations that you have not traditionally gone to, because you're going to meet all kinds of people through that process that you'd never even thought about, you know, who could contribute to your organization. So allyship, outreach to very diverse communities, and especially communities that you haven't thought about as potential sources for talent for your organization. And when you think about our communities, Muslim communities are extremely diverse. You know, they have men, women, and children that are very different from one another. So we cannot make assumptions about them. We need to be open to what they could bring to our organization. And you know, I talked about communities. There are many, many, many communities. And within those communities, there are many different people who can offer all kinds of knowledge, experience, lived experiences to your organization. So you can certainly reach out to organizations like ours, but I think the key word is to be creative, to think outside the box. If you keep on going back to the same way of recruiting people and bringing them in, you know, whether it's through your, you know, advertising your jobs and posting your jobs in certain places, start talking to different organizations and people that are out there doing the kind of work that we're doing. And it's really, really useful at the municipal level, because a lot of the people in our communities already volunteer. They're out there doing all kinds of great stuff. So think about them as possible places where you can actually tap those resources.
Thank you. All right, I do want to know, Nicole, why is it important that women are represented in decision-making positions, specifically at municipal government level?
It's integral that women are represented at municipal levels. I mean, when we look at key drivers, particularly around the feminization of poverty and those who experience the greatest amounts of disparities and lack of access. In most communities, it's women. And so to be able to have women at decision-making tables and diverse representations, I really want to underscore that, diverse representation of women's voices at the table, including racialized women and indigenous women and women with various abilities, trans women, across the board, and intersectional representation, is for the fact that in every municipality, those who are most marginalized are going to be women. And that you are going to have to not only hear and engage those women, but being able to sensitize yourself to the needs of women and children and what poverty looks like and what those social determinants of health factors that they that intersect, that they struggle with within your communities, that it has to be top of mind, it has to be top of conversation. It has to be one of those key drivers and indicators in terms of community wellness. And so an absence of women at the table bringing that intersectional voice, bringing that critical conversation and critical lens has to be important. And I say that in the context of, having women at the table is important, but if women do not feel that they can actually represent the voice of women and they just have to reproduce patriarchal sentiments, that's also not, that's not what I'm speaking of. It's not just women who kind of check the markers of being a woman, but speak all of the maleness, kind of that male culture, that patriarchal culture, and they just embody that through their female bodies, that's not the kind of representation that we're talking about. And it has to be the kind of workplace culture that allows for, the authentic, diverse voice of women to be at the table and to represent a catchment of those who are often most marginalized in their communities.
Sam, we're a couple of years out from the height of the Me Too movement, and I want to know from your perspective, has anything changed?
That's the million-dollar question. I think that what has changed is that there are more platforms available for women to share their experiences, to call out bad behavior. There is an awareness that things that were considered just very typical and acceptable behavior in the past, that is no longer the case, and that that if you engage in that behavior, you can and hopefully will be called out for it. Having said that, on a global level, we are witnessing a tremendous regression in the rights of women and girls, and also those who identify as women and girls throughout the world. I mean, even you just have to look to the United States for evidence of that impact in terms of their overturning of Roe versus Wade. But even in Afghanistan, with the rise of the Taliban and limits on girls' education, having said that, we as an organization have been given permission to resume our girls' education work at the primary level. So we are slowly trying to ensure that those rights continue into the future. But I think that we still have a tremendous amount of work to do, and I think that we, as women who live here in Canada, we automatically, by virtue of being here, whether we were born here, or whether we are immigrants here, or whether we are settlers, or whether we are Indigenous. We live in a very safe part of the world relative to other countries, and that comes with a degree of privilege for all of us, and it makes us very lucky. And I think that recognizing that there are still millions and millions of women and girls who don't even have a fraction of the opportunity that any single one of us has living here is really critical. And so that activism, that engagement, that concern should not end at our borders.
All right, so we have about 3 minutes left. I'm not going to say 1 minute each, but I do want to get your thoughts. If there are calls to action, what are they? And for the audience, what should we be taking home with us? Start with Nicole.
Well, you know, I do appreciate those who have earnestly attended to listen to this speak, because I think when we talk about really being responsive to the voice of women, and carving out space and time to listen to the issues that are top of mind, it begins with leadership, and it begins with, you know, most of you represent such amazing spaces across our province. And so the call to action would really be to look around your organization in an intentional way and look at the absence of women, intersectional women that are in your spaces and at decision-making tables, and actively make decisions and have targeted strategies in order to close those gaps, and doing that with a sense of urgency would be my call to action.
Is that?
Yes, my call to action would be for communities to be safe, for women in our communities particularly, especially those who are visibly Muslim, those who are racialized. Black Muslim women who wear the headscarf are the most vulnerable women that now engage in our society, whether it's on the street, when they're crossing the street, when they're on public transit, when they're in retail stores, or even when they're accessing services at the front line of a municipality. They're extremely vulnerable. So my call to action for you is to please do everything for their safety, pass bylaws that will stop street harassment of the women in our communities, because it is unacceptable in Canada in 2022 that just because you're a Black Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, you can be spat upon, called names, and actually assaulted in broad daylight.
Sam?
I think I'm going to be more philosophical on this one, in the sense that we all need people who believe in us at various ages and stages of our professional development and careers. And I would say that finding those people within your organizations, within your networks, providing that mentorship. Sometimes we reward the ones who are the most vocal, who weaponize their privilege because they've never known anything but that, who will seize the microphone, who will be the center of attention, who will tell you about all the wonderful things they've accomplished, and who will upsell themselves every waking minute of every single day. And we presume that that means that they're qualified and competent. Even when I look at who was able to speak about COVID, and I'm a public health doctor, and the vast majority of talking heads on television, 90% of them were males, and they weren't public health doctors, which was quite astonishing, which I think actually had a huge impact on some of the ways in which our policies evolved. And so my message would be to question who's getting ahead, why they're getting ahead at all times, and to nurture, to support, to believe in people who have perhaps a different point of view, who are maybe not instinctively going to put themselves out there. I was certainly one of those people, and thankfully had people who were around me who said, you've got this, you can do this. It doesn't matter that you're so nervous you want to vomit in your shoes right now. You get out there and say what you're going to say. And we all need that. And we especially need it in politics, because there are far too many people who are seizing those opportunities and who have very corrosive agendas. And if we don't confront them and if we don't speak up, they're going to dictate what happens to the rest of us.
Nicole, Nuzhat, Sam, thank you so much. Everyone, a round of applause. Thank you so much for taking the time for us. With that, that concludes the Women's Leadership Forum, as well as our morning plenary sessions.